program format this evening is the political pattern of Oklahoma. And as you all know, we have had a lot of politics in the past, we continue to have, and we take it all in stride. We're rather proud of our politics. In fact, when I took on a job here 29 years ago, as it will be this summer, former professor met me and he asked me where I was teaching, and when I told him down in Oklahoma, he said, you won't be there very long. He said, no one's ever there very long. He said, with every new governor, it's a new set of professors. And, he was several years behind, because just 2 years before I came, we established a little stability in our education institutions, and so we didn't all get fired every 4 years. But that's the way it was in the early days, and we've settled things down a lot now. And but we have enough going on in politics always to make it interesting. And to talk to us on Oklahoma politics for the period to 1960 is Dr. Duane Cummins, who is a professor of history at Oklahoma City University. He's been here some 8 years. Holds a bachelor's degree from our own Phillips University here in Oklahoma, a master's degree from Colorado Institution, and then the doctorate in history from the University of Oklahoma. A young man who has contributed a great deal to the culture of our state and our history in his instruction and in his research and in his writing. It's a very special privilege to introduce Dr. Duane Cummins of Oklahoma City University. Professor Cummins.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I appreciate those very kind remarks. I was intrigued with his description of the weather through which he passed and concluded that he did not ever leave the state of Oklahoma. I have been asked to make a general comment or two this evening about the political patterns of this state, and in particular to emphasize that period of time during the first 3 or 4 governorships of Oklahoma. I would say that the scholars of the political patterns of Oklahoma generally agree that you can subdivide the history of this state since 1907 into 3 general political periods. That period from 1907 to 1943 is generally looked upon as one of rough and tumble frontier politics. The early period, a period of growing, a period of seeking, a period of fumbling about, and a period of enlightenment, a period of many things, but it is generally considered the first period and one with a few rough edges. The second period, 1943 to 1955, is looked upon as the middle period, a time of transition, the years of Bob Kerr, the years of our initial industrialization, and many things that began to transform this state. 1955 to 1975 is generally considered the modern period in Oklahoma political history, when urbanization began to take root, when industrialization continued to spread. We've reached a time in 1975 when many observers believe we have inaugurated a period of reaction in the political history of the state. And it will be interesting to see if that forecast holds true. But there is some feeling that perhaps there is a limit to the amount of industrialization the state should have, a limit to the amount of or numbers of people that should live within the state, and perhaps we've reached a time of reaction. So, these are 4 very general categories in describing the history of this state since the year 1907. Now, because my remarks are concentrated in this early period, I thought it might be appropriate to give you a few characteristics of that time. It is looked upon as a time of executive initiative, a time of executive daring as they attempted consolidation of state agencies, as they attempted many things. It is also looked upon as a time of intimidation of our chief executives, and that gives us something of a paradox because we find both of these factors extant during that early period. It is a time of enlightenment, reform, and progressivism. We were born at such a time as a state when the muckrakers were writing and publishing widely, and when there was great belief in the capacity of man to control his fate and to determine his future and to reform the state of things that he was experiencing. That was on one hand. On the other hand, that early period was a time of bigotry, a time of narrowness of perspective, so that again we have a severe paradox in the history of that early period. It was a time when local government was emphasized, and it was a time when the state government was being emphasized, and that led to direct hostility. So it is a period of turmoil, a period of creativity, a period of searching that I want to talk about this evening and try to discern some of the political patterns that stem from it. One of the most interesting characteristics, and one that the nation generally associates with this state, is the fact that we have a one-party system, or so it seems on the surface to many. That really isn't true, but at least that is the reputation and the heritage that we have. And where did it begin? To find the roots of it, we need to look into the territorial days when the government in Washington, D.C. was appointing our territorial governors. And from 1890 until 1907, every single one of those was a Republican with one exception. And it seemed indeed that we were going to be a one-party state, but a Republican one-party state. It didn't turn out that way. It's a different story. It has a different ending. But in the beginning, it appeared that this would be a Republican state. That is why there was great discussion in Washington and hopes for a time that two states would emerge, because that would mean 4 Republican senators instead of 2. It would mean an additional number of Republican representatives. But as we go through these governors, we notice a strange thing. Governor Steele, George Steele, the very first one, was territorial governor for only 1 year, 1890 to 1891. Robert Martin, 1891, 1892. Abraham C., 1892, 1893. And when we get down to the year 1901, we actually have 4 territorial governors serving a portion of that one single year. And we wonder, what in the world, all of this turnover, what is wrong? Well, it seems that Oklahomans are very proud people, and they dislike what they call carpetbag government. The federal government in Washington appointing someone from New York or someone from Ohio or someone from someplace else to come in and to rule the future of Oklahomans. They much prefer to have someone from Oklahoma appointed to this position of governor, territorial governor. Therefore, these governors, when they came in, found it extremely difficult to function and set a pattern that has carried through right to our own day. The governors in the history of this state have really had a terrible time. It wasn't until Bob Kerr that one of them had enough support that he could be elected to the Senate. Many of them tried, but they were never elected. And although they took the precaution of limiting the term to 1 term and 4 years in the Constitution, that really seems to have been unnecessary in retrospect, because not a one of them could have been reelected anyway. Well, in any case, during this territorial period, as the governors began to hold office, only a couple of them had staying power. The first of these was William Renfro, a Democrat from Norman, who happened to be the banker in Norman, who was appointed in 1893 and served until 1897. He was appointed by President Cleveland, and he was an Oklahoman, and the people liked the idea that he was from their territory. Therefore, they stuck with him. Now, Cassius Barnes was another, and he is a Republican. You see, I want to be sure that I balance this. First one was a Democrat who had staying power. The next was a Republican from 97 until 1901. But he was from New York, and we find that he had a very difficult, tumultuous time as territorial governor. That was the period of the Free Homes Bill. It was the period of the Spanish-American War, when a number of Oklahomans were enlisted into Roosevelt's Rough Rider group and participated and came back very excited about that. As a matter of fact, one of them later became a territorial governor, Frank France, 1906 to 1907, the very last one. There was another Oklahoman that served, Tom Ferguson, who founded the Watonga Republican. He was a newspaperman. And he served as governor during the territorial days. But the point of all of this is very simple. One Oklahomans wanted someone from within. They did not want an appointed official coming in from the outside. They much preferred someone who understood them. And all of these were being appointed by Republican presidents with one exception. And so it was kind of a misleading thing, thinking that all of the people liked these Republican-appointed executives. Well, I'm sure that you have been through, according to Paul Lambert, the Organic Act in 1890, the Curtis Act of 1898, and the Enabling Act of 1906 leading to statehood, so you have that well in mind. There is one thing that is very significant in producing the future political history of the state, and it was a part of the Enabling Act that required that a convention be called in Guthrie, and that it consist of 55 people from Oklahoma Territory, 55 people from Indian Territory, and 2 from the Osage Nation. Now, that is significant because the people were to go to the polls to elect those conventionaires. And when the election was held on November the 4th, it turned out that 100 of the 112 were Democrats who were elected in that election. Only 2 were Republicans. The other 10 represented a variety of populists, independents, and so on. From that moment, we have a one-party history in the making. The Democrats control the convention, control the machinery, control the formulas for future elections and all of the rest, control the making of the counties, and thereby install themselves as a one-party state. And we will note later on that they take all sorts of precautions to protect that one-party system. Well, it might be in order also to take a look at the makeup of that constitutional convention to see just where the power was. Some 47 of them represented the farm bloc throughout the state. Heavy emphasis on the rural sections of Oklahoma. 27 were attorneys. They're always involved, you see, those things. 12 were merchants. There were 3 teachers, 6 clergy, 2 doctors, and 1 student, a fellow named Weaver from the University of Oklahoma, who didn't have a whole lot to say as we look back through the records, but he was there and represented an important constituency. So that rural bloc is a dominating factor in the convention, and they're almost exclusively Democratic. And there we have the initial power structure of the state reflected for us in this convention. I assume you've been through the convention. That material has all been digested, and we're ready to move forward. So, I shall begin then with the first governor of the state of Oklahoma, Charles Haskell, taking office in 1907 and trying to show that Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory had been successfully united, began his term in office with a mock wedding on the steps of the Capitol building in Guthrie, the bride being from Indian Territory and the groom from Oklahoma Territory. And this wedding showed that there was now one state, unity, had been brought about. This man Haskell is an interesting character, an unusually capable man, and is generally ranked among the top 3 governors in the history of the state, which would include Kerr, J. Howard Edmondson, and Charles Haskell. Very capable, very dynamic personality, something of an adventurer, a man who made and lost several fortunes in his lifetime, who spent an impoverished youth in Ohio, but later came to Oklahoma, attracted here by the growth of railroads near Muskogee. His term is considered a rather progressive one in that he started the state banking system, the guarantee system, in which deposits were guaranteed, with each bank paying 1% of their deposits, so that if the bank experienced a run or depression occurred, they would have the funds to insure any account that it held. Well, he started that. He created the registration of trusts. He was very instrumental in trying to enforce prohibition, which you will recall was to be enforced for 21 years. The couple of other things important about this early period is the fact that William Murray remains a very popular and significant character in the early history of the state as first Speaker of the House of Representatives, as a perennial candidate for the governorship of the state. And in addition to that, our first 2 senators included Robert Owen and Thomas Gore, the blind senator from Oklahoma. Chief Justice R.L. Williams, who had been instrumental in creating the Democratic Party in Indian Territory, and now created the judicial system and would go on to become governor of the state of Oklahoma. Well, it is an active period. The legislature is passing child labor laws, safety codes for the miners, health and sanitation codes, creating a school system for the state, passing the Billups Booze Bill in 1907, which made it illegal to transport, manufacture, or possess alcoholic beverages. But it said nothing about selling them, nothing about consuming them, only transporting, manufacturing, and possessing. Senate Bill number 1, interestingly, was a set of Jim Crow codes based upon the doctrine prominent at that time of separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites. That was Senate Bill number 1. In 1910, that was followed by a grandfather clause in Oklahoma because it was noted that blacks were voting in blocks and they were voting Republican. And it was felt something had to be done about that because Republicans were gaining just a little bit of power as a result of the block voting. And so one of the laws read that you could vote as long as your lineal heritage going back to January 1st, 1866 had voted. And that, of course, effectively eliminated all blacks in the state of Oklahoma. If that didn't do the job, then literacy tests were installed also, and the tests were given on our state constitution. Now, have any of you ever looked at our state constitution carefully? It's a most interesting document. It stands in need of revision, but even at its first appearance, it was a difficult instrument to digest. And to give a literacy test on that is something that many people, no matter the level of education, would not welcome. Well, in any case, these things were instituted. Another interesting thing that occurred during Haskell's term of office, when the two territories were joined, eastern Oklahoma complained that they had not been given any of the state's institutions, that all of them had been planted in Oklahoma Territory, the University of Oklahoma, A&M at Stillwater. The capital was in the western part of the state, and the eastern part of the state believed they had really been shortchanged, and they demanded that they receive some of the state institutions. So in a very benevolent spirit, that legislature placed the state prison at McAllister. They put the mental hospital at Veneta, the delinquent boys' home at Paul's Valley, the school for the deaf at Sulphur, school for the blind at Fort Gibson, Confederate Veterans Home at Ardmore. You see how benevolent they were. And, of course, colleges at Durant, Ada, and Tahlequah to help equalize things. One of the results of this was that we had more institutions of higher learning per capita than probably any other space on the face of the earth. Just institutions of higher learning every place, and it became an excessive burden on the state legislature, and future governors, we will note, faced impeachment by trying to eliminate some of these. Once you have an alumna established, they feel very dear to that institution, and if you try to eliminate it, you're immediately in trouble. And this is what one of our governors is going to find in just a few moments. In any case, the eastern half of the state received some state institutions. Now there was another question of some interest, and that, of course, was where the state capital would be located. Haskell was functioning in Guthrie, but he was not well received there, being a Democrat, and that being referred to in the press as a Republican nest. The place was filled with Republicans, and he didn't like that at all, but they were intent on keeping the capital in that city. So the governor decided that it would be put to public referendum on June the 10th, and in the year 1910. But one thing the bill did not specify is that after the vote was taken and it was determined where the capital would be, nothing was said as to when that would occur. Now you recall the old Enabling Act said it would remain in Guthrie until 1913. But this new referendum said nothing about when. It just said we're going to decide where the capital will be. So after the votes were counted, Guthrie had some 31,000, Oklahoma City 96,000, and Shawnee 8,000. And it was determined that the new capital would be Oklahoma City. Well, Governor Haskell wasted no time. Sometime after midnight, in the early hours of June the 11th, one of his secretaries stole the state seal from the Capitol at Guthrie and brought it to the Lee Huckins Hotel in Oklahoma City, and this became the new Capitol bright and early the next morning. Well, that just simply, Guthrie was having a stroke over this change of events, and as a matter of fact, it resulted in lawsuits. Coyle versus Oklahoma went all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Now, Coyle had a real interest in this because he had bought a great deal of the land in Guthrie for development. You see, looking ahead to the time when that would be the state capital, and the result was he took it to court and lost by a vote of 3-2 in the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But not stopping there, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where again the decision was upheld, and Oklahoma City remained the capital of the state of Oklahoma. Well, that brings us to our second governor, Lee Cruce, C-R-U-C-E. 1911 to 1914, he served as governor of the state. Haskell, as I said, was born in Ohio. Cruce is born in Kentucky. Again, we have to go all the way to Bob Kerr before we have a governor born in the state of Oklahoma. All of them are born someplace else until that time. He was an attorney and a banker who arrived before statehood, who, in the interest of building an estate, married a Chickasaw woman. And that was a good thing to do in those days because that gave you rights to certain property, you see, within the state. He was also appointed an OU regent, worked himself up through the political structure, and was successful in his campaign for the governorship of Oklahoma. He ran on a platform of economy. Said, previous governor has spent far too much. The records show that Governor Haskell had spent a total of $4 million, and when Cruce left office, he had spent $9 million. So this platform of economy turned out to be a rather meaningless platform from the very beginning. Well, he gets himself in trouble immediately because in this economy drive, he is cutting out some things that are held very dear to the hearts of people. One of those was A&M College at Stillwater. He suggested that it be eliminated. It was unnecessary to have it, and that, of course, led him into deep trouble. The legislature brought impeachment proceedings against Governor Cruce for suggesting such a thing. This is the first of many. I don't know if it's a world's record or even a national record, but we have more than our share of attempted impeachments throughout the history of Oklahoma, particularly in this early period. And that leads me back to a general statement I made in the beginning. Even though these governors were very daring, at times they were intimidated by the legislature, who continually threatened to impeach them if they didn't do what they wanted them to do. Well, he begins a program of building roads because our population was now over 1.5 million. The automobile was beginning to take root, but we had no roads. And so, so he began to try to develop a program in this area. One of the things was to create a state highway department, the head of whom was Sidney Suggs, appointed as chief of the highway department. Haskell attempted to run for the United States Senate, and as you might expect, was defeated soundly and was not elected. When the legislature failed in its attempt to impeach Governor Cruce, they were not to be denied something for their efforts, and so they proceeded, and they impeached the state auditor, the state insurance commissioner, and the state printer. And they really felt good after they had managed to do all of this. They at least had something to show for all of the efforts and all of the research they had put into it. Well, Governor Cruce also started another tradition. When trouble began to appear in certain parts of the state, he would call out the militia. And we find that governor after governor after governor uses this as a means of discipline, as a means of control. Cruce used it to stop horse races which were often held on Sundays, prize fights which he considered to be illegal, all in an attempt to enforce the Sunday blue laws. And if something appeared out of order, you wouldn't be at all surprised to see the state militia just appear and take control of whatever it was that was going on. Governor Cruce is a very religious man. He is very much a reformer. And we find this being reflected in many of his decisions. For example, there were no executions during his term in office because he did not believe in capital punishment. As a matter of fact, he commuted 22 death sentences to life imprisonment. He is a man of integrity, a man of patience, a man of vision. He is the one who created a commission for the first industrial surveys of the state to find where our oil deposits were, what the future potential of our water power might be, what our mineral deposits meant. He is the one who inaugurated this direction for the state. Well, we have another first as a state. 1914, in the primaries for Democratic gubernatorial nominee, there are 8 people who are wanting it, campaigning very hard for it. The man who finished third was Al Jennings. Now, Al Jennings, if you're not aware, was a renowned bank robber, train robber, and decided that he had the qualifications to be governor of Oklahoma and finished a very close third in this race. The winner had only 33,000 votes, the loser 31,000, and Al Jennings had something like 26,000. And the other 5 finished after that. Now, Oklahoma has a very strange, unique history. You can study the history of any other state in the Union, and you have a pretty good pattern for the other 48. But Oklahoma is, as what one historian calls, an anomaly. I mean, it is different, strange, weird. There's nothing really to compare to the history of Oklahoma. In my opinion, it is the only state that deserves individual study. If you study the history of Illinois, you've also studied the history of Indiana and Ohio and a couple of others. But not so here. We're the only ones that had land openings like we have. That list is rather extensive, but here is another first that just occurred to me in having this train robber and bank robber running for the governorship of the state. And it didn't help our image a great deal either, I might add, nationally. But fortunately, R.L. Williams won the nomination, formerly Chief Justice, a man of impeccable reputation, a man of judicial experience, born in Alabama, still not an Oklahoman, born in Alabama, trained as a Methodist minister, who for years was a circuit rider down in Texas, who then became a school teacher, who then entered the field of law, and finally came to Oklahoma during the Cherokee Outlet run in 1893. And that is when he sunk his roots into this state of Oklahoma. He is the man who founded the Democratic Party in Indian Territory that I told you about a bit earlier. His administration is an interesting one. Probably no other governor in the history of our state consolidated so much power in the governor's office as he did. He began by eliminating all of these state boards. So we don't need all of these. We need only one. And he consolidated them into State Board of Affairs. And not only did he appoint the people to that board, he also determined their salaries. And here was a man with a lot of clout, a lot of power. Now that is unusual in a state that impeaches so many of her governors, or attempts to impeach so many of her governors. Well, one of the interesting things that occurred was moving into our new Capitol building during Governor Williams' term in office on January the 1st, 1917. It had been started during the term of Governor Cruz, but they moved in January. Due to the fact that steel was so difficult to purchase during the days of World War I, and the fact that the state had run out of money appropriated for the Capitol dome, it was decided they would not build a dome, originally for those reasons, but then subsequently as a matter of distinction, of being the only Capitol without a dome in the United States. This further gives us distinction, you see. And so it was decided that there would not be a dome placed on our state capitol. During Williams' term in office, there are a number of demonstrations and riots throughout the state. Some of them occur on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, and some are on the right-hand side. On the left, we find the anti-draft demonstrations throughout the state of people who protested our participation in the First World War. Those are generally known as the Green Corn Rebellion. On the right-hand side, we have some American patriotic demonstrations that the American Protective League and the Knights of Liberty carried out. Anybody who wasn't buying war bonds, anyone who was thought to be subversive or trying to sabotage America's efforts in this war, were subject to warnings, or subject to having their barn burned down, or subject to something else, so that you would be sure to be patriotic. We will force you to be free men in this situation. So, my point is that these demonstrations had root on both sides of the political spectrum, both the left and the right. One side is not any more guilty than the other. Well, that leads us to the fourth governor and the final one that I will discuss this evening, because the first part of this early period ends in 1922, and I understand the next speaker will be picking up after that. J.B. Robertson, born in Iowa, still not an Oklahoma governor. Born in Iowa, moved to Kansas, became a lawyer, settled in Chandler, Oklahoma, where he began teaching school. His administration is remembered primarily for highway construction, some 1,300 miles of it, more than all of his predecessors combined. The automobile was really now beginning to make inroads into the state. A number of school reforms were instituted during Robertson's administration, in that separate boards were set up again for each of the universities rather than having them all consolidated into one. It was generally accepted now that school teachers ought to be certified. Prior to Governor Robertson's administration, a lot of people felt capable of teaching school, and a lot of them taught school. But now it was thought maybe some restrictions ought to be placed on just who was allowed in a classroom and who was and who was not considered professional at the task. Consolidation of schools occurred. Subsidizing of textbooks occurred for the first time. So his administration is also known for school reform. It is also marked by the post-war recession, strikes. The bank system collapsed that they had so carefully nurtured during the days of Haskell. Suddenly, it was no more. 9,000 miners were on strike in the state. Riots were beginning to occur. And martial law was instituted in various parts of the state to help control these events. In 1920, people, having grown fatigued with Wilsonian high idealism and the demands of war, decided to put Wilson aside and elect in his place someone who was more near the middle of the road. And so Harding was overwhelmingly elected, the first time that the electorate in Oklahoma had voted for a Republican president, and the last time they did until Dwight Eisenhower. But Harding was elected. And also that was the first time that women voted in the state of Oklahoma. And interestingly, they elected a woman to the House of Representatives, only the second one in United States history. And her name was Alice Robertson. Now, there was some unrest with Robertson, with all of the strikes, with the recession, and all of the rest. And there was an attempt made once again to impeach this governor as well. It failed by one vote, just as the impeachment attempt on Cruz failed by one vote. But again, they were not to be denied, and were successful in impeaching the lieutenant governor, Trapp. So someone always gets it, you see, before it's over with, even though they begin with the governor himself. I suspect that one of the very significant things of this governor's term in office is the Tulsa race riot. That occurred on May the 31st, 1921. A black man named Dick Rowland was arrested on the charge of molesting a young white girl. Immediately, a mob gathered with the purpose in mind of lynching Rowland. Another mob gathered with the intent of protecting Mr. Rowland. The result is what the Tulsa papers, if you look at the microfilm and the old editions, call a mini war. 2 miles of Tulsa was burned to the ground. 70 blacks were killed, 9 whites were killed. Martial law was declared in the city and held that way for some long time. Now, in looking across the state at newspapers in many of the small communities, I was astounded to note that that wasn't even reported in many of the local newspapers across Oklahoma. It was carried in the Oklahoma City papers and the Tulsa papers as front page news, but many of the smaller communities made no mention that it had occurred. Well, this was also the governor's, the period of time in which 2 organizations that I mentioned earlier the Knights of Liberty and the American Protective League merged into a single organization called the Ku Klux Klan, and its membership grew to 100,000 individuals. It became a political force in the state of Oklahoma during the early 1920s, claiming to be anti-black, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, but being pro-isolationism in our foreign policy. Many of the techniques used by the former organizations were used by this organization to bring people into line, causing them to adhere to what they considered to be Oklahoma philosophy. Well, once again, I think it might be in order to repeat what I stated at the outset, that this early period was a time of daring and a time of intimidation, a time of enlightenment and reform, a time of bigotry, narrowness of perspective, a time of liberalism, a time of reaction, a time of local entrenchment, and a time of building a state government. It was a period of turmoil, a period of creativity, a period of fumbling, searching, growing. Thank you very much.
Duane, we've heard of your good work for all these years, and now we really know how good it is. We do appreciate your being here, and thank you again and again. Before we take our 10-minute break, I believe that our executive director, Paul